Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Survive and Thrive, How to Become Truly Cyber Resilient. I'm Laura Shafer, the Vice President of Product Marketing here at 1111 Systems. I'd like to introduce today's speakers who are joining me for our presentation. First is Jon Murry, who is the Director of Consulting Operations here at 1111 Systems. We're also joined by Brian Majowicz, who is a Cyber Risk and Resilience Specialist at 1111. These are the right people for our discussion about cyber resilience. So before I turn the time over to our experts, I want to highlight exactly why it is so critical to be focused on cyber resilience right now. It shouldn't be a surprise, but it is sometimes, but we always say it, it truly is a matter of when your organization will be hit with a cyber attack these days. There is no if anymore. 80% of organizations had a ransomware attack that resulted in a data breach in 2024. So you can do the math over the last few years. Effectively, every organization was hit over the last few years. The victims are tending to pay the ransom to get their data because nearly 3/4 of the time, the criminals are at least partially successful in preventing businesses from recovering on their own. They can completely stop recovery, those criminals. They can stop those recovery efforts 1/3 of the time, which is pretty scary. So what are the effects of these cyber attacks? Well, businesses were seeing about 1/4 of their data compromised by these successful attacks, and they were able to recover about 2/3 of their data. Basically, if you do the math, about 17% was irrecoverable data loss. That's kind of scary if you're in the data business. It's going to take more than a week to recover following a cyber incident based on these studies and get back to full operations. This is so important to know as you're preparing your businesses for cyber resilience and getting together your cyber resilience plans and strategies, which is why we turn to experts like Jon and Brian to help us figure out what you need as an organization to be truly cyber resilient. So Jon, Brian, basically, where should people start? What's the first step for them?
Thanks, Laura. So as Laura mentioned, I'm Brian Majowicz, Cyber Risk and Resilience Specialist with the consulting team here at 1111. And I am joined by Jon Murry, Director of Consulting Operations. Jon, I think a good place to start here, in your role, you have an opportunity to speak to a lot of our customers and really hear about a lot of their challenges around cyber risk and resilience. Let's start off, could you share some, what you're hearing from your role from some of our customers about their challenges with cyber risk and resilience?
Absolutely. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, the challenges that I see when I'm talking to customers, there are a couple of them. The first one's really the organizational segmentation. It's just a natural part of working in the corporate world that we've got different departments, and there are so many departments now that are responsible for risk in some way, and cyber risk in particular. So in my role, I work with a lot of companies and teams that do business continuity, disaster recovery, and they're analyzing the sensitivity of their data, right? They're thinking about cyber risk in terms of what kind of personal identifiable information am I holding? Or the disaster recovery team is thinking about, if I have a cyber event, is the data that I'm backing up going to be clean and recoverable? But we also are working with organizations, network or infrastructure team, and they may be looking at cyber resilience in a very different way, right? They might be looking at it from the perspective of intrusion protection or firewalls or things like that. So not so much looking at the data, but looking at their vulnerabilities or how you're going to get to that data. So if teams aren't working together or talking to each other about these different risks, then there's going to be exposure, there are going to be gaps, there even could be redundancies. But either way, it could be a problem for the organization. The other challenge I see is the paralysis that comes with just how complex the cyber resilience issues are and how many different issues or components there are to it. Cyber, as you all know, touches everything. Touches your network security, your data security, how you classify your data, your company's ability to respond to an event is a cyber risk that you have to think about, the recoverability, all of these issues that you have to think about when you're talking about cyber and understanding how you're exposed. So what we do to address this is we try to normalize all these variables. So Brian's going to talk about how we organize the information around your risk controls or around your vulnerabilities. But what we do is we normalize the data by factoring in real world financial information that's sourced from cyber insurance companies. So that way we can provide actual financial risks associated to the different areas that we're talking about. This way you get a really good, red, yellow, green analysis that uses financial data to give you more of an apples to apples benchmark across all the different dimensions that we're talking about today. And that will help you ultimately prioritize where you focus your effort and where you focus your spend. So now that we understand some of those challenges, I'll let Brian talk about how we address them and how our assessment and the way we do things is used by our customers.
Thanks, John. That's great insight. So what I want to dig into now is a little bit more on the why. So we talk about, the reasons why we want to conduct a cyber resilience assessment. And there's a lot of different use cases for that. So while the outcomes and overall outcomes that organizations are looking for may be similar, the details that they're trying to include with that really comes from their use case for the main driver behind what they're trying to accomplish with the cyber resilience assessment. So I'm going to give you some examples of different types of use cases that potentially we're seeing as drivers for going through a cyber resilience assessment. So the very first one is really the ability to assess and report risk. So fundamentally, everyone really wants to understand, where do I have risk? Where am I exposed? Where am I vulnerable? So one of those items you'll see there is the cyber risk baseline. That takes a look at your overall resilience program, and we'll take a look for gaps, areas that can be improved, look at things like maturity, and risk reduction over time potentially. So if you're doing a benchmark, you have a starting point, so you can measure yourself over time to see if we're maintaining, improving, or are we falling behind. AI is a huge player right now and a concern for a lot of organizations. So really understanding specific threats or vulnerabilities, how do we stack up against those specific threats that may be uncovered through AI? They establish vulnerability, and then they try to exploit that. So for some organizations, having a deep dive within specific threats or vulnerabilities can be a good driver for them going through a cyber resilience assessment. For others, they're concerned about things like good practices. So that can come from compliance frameworks. Or potentially they're trying to demonstrate to their insurance provider that they're doing good work around cyber resilience. And as a result, they deserve a better premium than other organizations that may be less prepared or a higher risk for the insurance provider to take on. There's also the idea potentially of optimizing investments. So going through a cyber resilience assessment, the way we do it, we can model future investments. So if I want to compare product A versus product B, how does that help me? Where does it reduce my risk? From a financial perspective, what does that look like as far as a cost versus risk reduction? So maybe I'm spending $100,000 on this new control, but it's going to reduce my cyber risk by $1 million. So it gives us better data points to make those future investments. It could be investment prioritization. So we get the view of where our gaps are, understanding, where that high risk is, or potentially, maybe we want to take a financial spin on it. Where do I get the most value for my dollar? So if I'm spending, money and I only have a fixed budget on this, where will I get the most return on my investment? So different ways you can, slice and dice that by going through a resilience assessment. Also, there's the idea of, justifying your budget. So again, it's a struggle right now for a lot of organizations to demonstrate to their leadership whether or not they're spending enough around cyber resilience. So by giving the the idea of qualifying your risk, coupling that with financials can really make a strong case for justifying budget. So whether that's maintaining or increasing, you'll have the justifications behind that. It could also be things like controls rationalization. So, maybe I am overinvested in certain tools. I have 3 different products that are doing the same thing, or, maybe I can accomplish the same things with product A that I accomplish right now with products B and C, and only be spending for the one product. So I can look at, different things like that, going through one of these assessments. And then kind of a final common area is, again, quantifying that risk. Right now, a lot of organizations will do more of a qualitative type risk assessment, where John was talking about a little while ago. You might get a result of high, medium, low, red, yellow, green. But the challenge we run into is that that's interesting, but for a lot of organizations, they're going to have from their senior leadership, what does that actually mean? Okay, that's interesting, but what does that mean? I have high risk. Help me understand what that means to our organization. So by doing risk quantification, you can put financials around that. So whether that's understanding kind of your inherent risk, what we face at face value, or a residual view of that, what risk remains after our investments. We can also look at things like financial impact. So understanding these different threats and risk around cyber and what that potentially means to our organization from a financial perspective. Executive reporting, putting everything into an easy way to understand this. John touched on, there's a lot of pieces. There's a lot of segmentation. There's a lot of complexity. It's difficult to be a practitioner and an expert in all these areas. So we have to make it easy for the executives and board level to understand really where we stand. And then other areas, potentially peer benchmarking, understanding what our peers are facing and really how we stack up against those. So again, these use cases can become your primary driver for what the outcomes, the details around your outcomes or outputs from an assessment. Okay, so let's take a step back and talk about the foundations of cyber risk and resilience. So the very first thing is we want to make sure we're all looking at risk the same way. The way that we define risk is really understanding your threats, probability. So what's the likelihood that I'm going to be impacted by a specific cyber threat? On the other side is understanding what that impact is. So I have threat A, which may be something like ransomware. What does that look like for an organization like mine? So if I put those together, the probability of the threat as well as the impact of the threat if it's realized, that gives me my inherent risk. Okay, so this is your risk that your organization faces without any consideration of investment you made. So at face value, this is what we're looking at. Now, hopefully, all of your organizations have made some level of investment into cyber resilience by investing in specific controls. So think products and services. Now, when we do that, that reduces our risk and leaves us with our residual risk. So again, we start off with that big triangle, we get it down to the smaller triangle of our remaining risk. And that's really what we're talking about when we say cyber resilience. So the cyber resilience is achieved through our controls, our investments that we've made to really buy down that risk. Okay, to put it in a basic formula, the way we try to make this a little bit easier to digest for everyone is we basically define cyber resilience as a combination of both your preventive risk controls, so think cybersecurity, and your reactive risk controls, so cyber recovery and response. So if you put those together, really you have the two sides that give you cyber resilience. Now, it seems pretty simple, but we know it's not quite that easy. There's a lot more to it. So again, this is where a lot of organizations tend to get overwhelmed, is how do we put this into a nice, organized way that everyone can understand to give us the holistic view of where we stand from a resilience perspective. So the way we've done it at 1111 is we've broken both of those, the preventive as well as the reactive, into what we call our cyber resilience pillars. So for preventive, you'll see at the top there, offensive security through defensive security. And then for reactive, starting with your monitor and detect, so aware that we've had some type of incident, all the way through recovery. Now, within those, there are a lot of different pieces. So again, this is where it becomes overwhelming. It's very difficult to be a practitioner or an expert in all of these different areas. You may have people that are, experts, subject matter experts within specific areas, but it might only be certain items even within a pillar. So even within individual pillars, there is a lot to know. What you're seeing on the screen are just some examples. There's actually more beyond this of different controls we would be looking for an organization to have within each of these pillars, which then would give your resiliency to your organization. Okay, so now that we have the foundations down and we're all speaking the same language on that, let's move into the actual cyber resilience assessment overview. Now, as I talk through this today, I'm going to talk about how we do it at 1111 through our consulting team. But for your organization, if you're trying to accomplish the same thing on your own, think about these different pieces that you're going to have to account for and how you're going to come up with those different data points as you go through. Okay, so we talked about use cases. Those use cases really drive our outcomes. So again, at a high level, we could be talking about things like understanding our control gaps and vulnerabilities. Where are we strong? Where are we weak? Where can we make improvement? Where should we try to invest additionally? It's understanding our cyber threat probability. So we talked about the risk triangle. We need to know the likelihood or probability that we're going to be impacted by these specific cyber threats. Other side of the triangle for risk is the impact. We have to have a way to establish and understand what's the potential impact if one of these cyber threats is realized. Okay. And then again, we talked about making it easy for everyone to understand. You can't be an expert in everything, but from a senior leadership, executive leadership, board level, we have to be able to present this to them in a way that they're going to be able to understand really what our risk is and really where it makes sense for us to make additional investments. Okay, so that's kind of our high-level drivers for our outcomes. Okay, now, to do that, we talked about we have to have these different data points, and we need reliable data so we can trust the outcomes that we get from the assessment. So as John mentioned early on, the approach that we've taken is we're leveraging a tool that uses an insurance database to pull from insurance claims data, those most like your organization. So with that, we're able to understand, okay, what are the types of cyber threats that are impacting your type of organization? What does that look like from a financial perspective? So at face value, that inherent risk, what does that look like? And then also, we need to understand the residual. So we talked about the value of controls. So in the bottom right there, an additional piece that's been done through our assessment is MITRE tech threat landscape mapping. So this way we're able to understand the value of the controls you've invested in. So what's it reduced the likelihood of? What's it reduced the impact of? What has it reduced the overall financial exposure for? Okay, we also need to make sure that the numbers are accurate. So in this case, the tool that we're leveraging has very sophisticated machine learning algorithms and AI to make sure that we're getting accurate results. So from that insurance claims database of over 290,000 claims, we don't want to see all the data that's in there. We need to see, the data from the organizations that are most like ours. So think company size, industry, headquarters, number of employees. Okay, and we also need to have data points that are going to help our leaders. So in this case, we had input from over 100 CISOs to understand really what are their challenges, what data points do they really need to understand. Okay, so again, if you're trying to do this on your own and you don't have access to an insurance database like we do, you're going to need to do some research on what potential cyber threats our type of organization can most likely to face. So again, you may have more limited data sets. You're going to be pulling from data that's available online. So that would only be from publicly disclosed incidents versus the cyber insurance database is going to have anyone that's made an insurance claim. Okay, so you have to have a way of establishing those financials. You're also going to have to come up with a way to understand the value of the investments that you've made. So in your different controls, how do I assess how much I've reduced that impact by? Okay, so again, by our assessment, we're using the MITRE attack threat landscape to really, again, give us confidence in the investments that we made and how much that's reduced the risk. Okay, so the way we do this, again, leveraging our insurance database, is we start off with identifying a company profile. So in the example here, you're going to see a US-based company. So again, some key data points here: annual revenue, the company type, is it public, private, number of employees, headquarters location, and what industry is your company in. So in this example here, it's mostly it's 100% one industry. If your organization maybe is broken into a few different industries, we have the ability to break it out by percentage, and that will then allow our tool to go out to that insurance database and find those other companies that have had insurance claims that are most like your company. Okay, so once we do that, we very quickly can get a result. So in this case, on the left-hand side here, what you're going to see for this sample company, they have almost 112 million of inherent financial risk. So again, I think that's the big triangle before we did any type of reduction. We can also see kind of the top three threats that this type of organization is most likely to face. In the middle right now, you can see the residual is grayed out because we haven't accounted for any of the controls. We've only put in basically our company profile, which is giving us our inherent. And the same thing on the far right. Our loss probability right now is 100% because we haven't accounted for any of our controls to reduce the risk. So right now, for any of those threat types, assuming we didn't make any investment, there's a 100% probability that we're going to have a loss if a threat actor targets us. Okay, so the inherent is helpful. We understand really at face value what we're facing. But now to understand the residual, what we have to do is really account for all of the control investments. So in this case, the way we do it is through data collection. We break out our controls into the different categories. These are all mapped back to those cyber resilience pillars. So really think about what we're identifying here at a minimum is the products, services, plans, procedures that you've already invested in for your cyber resilience. Now, if you want to get a more accurate picture of where we actually are from a residual perspective, we also then can get into things like coverage. So maybe I invested in this great new product A, that does all these great things, but I've only rolled it out to 10% of my environment. I don't want to get full credit for that, so I would reduce the coverage down to the 10%. Same thing, a maturity perspective. I may have a software tool that has really great functionality. If we had everything configured properly, it has a really high maturity score. But unfortunately, out of the box, it doesn't come configured like that. It does very little. So if I have that deployed in my environment, but I haven't taken the time to configure it yet, I don't want to take the full maturity credit on that. I probably want to reduce that to really account for our use of the tool as it's been deployed right now. Okay, and then again, if you want to go even further, we can do financial analysis around spend versus risk reduction on investment. So again, by collecting all this, we get an understanding of where we stand today from a residual perspective. So understanding all those investments we've made. So once those have been entered in, again, very quickly, we're able to see our residual. So on the far left again, our inherent hasn't changed. That was at face value with no consideration of controls. In the middle, though, you can see the residual. We went from almost $112 million of inherent risk down to a little over 40 million. And our probability went from 100% down to 35%. So again, this reflects those investments we've already made into our cyber resilience program. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit more now on the outcome. So we talked early on about our use cases, and the use cases would probably drive the details that we're including with our outcomes. So one of those areas may be impacts analysis. So the sample you're seeing up on the screen right now, we've seen this in kind of a high-level dashboard view so far. On the far left, you're seeing in the inherent. So there's that almost $112 million of inherent risk. But in this case, you're seeing the full list of insurance tracking categories. So 16 categories they use, and the breakout of the impact for each of those insurance categories for our company. In the middle, it's reflecting how much risk we've mitigated. So that was through our controls that we loaded in. So those investments we made, what was our risk reduction on investment? So in this case, it reduced risk by over $71 million. So if I take my inherent, subtract and mitigate it, that then leaves us with our residual. So that's the risk that remains. So again, thinking back to the triangle, far left was the big triangle. The middle there was those controls that we applied. and the far right is the smaller triangle, the remaining residual risk. Okay, we can also do a deeper dive into the impacts analysis. So for example, maybe we want to understand a little bit better inherently what we're facing. So for our company, in this case, the sample company, concentration risk is around data. So you can see a lot of the data risk categories or cyber risk categories for the insurance tracking are around data. So things like cyber extortion, so ransomware or malicious breach, stealing data, unintentional disclosure of the data. So really a lot of the data categories coming into play for this organization. 47% of the total inherent is coming directly from those data impact categories. Okay, and again, we can do a little bit deeper dive, whether it's regulatory compliance, depending on your organization, really what are the focal points and what's going to speak the loudest to your leadership to help them understand the challenges. Okay, we can do the same thing on the residual. So the question we get a lot of times around the residual is, have we gone far enough? And that's a difficult question for us to answer because every organization is going to be a little bit different. Risk appetite's different, but potentially there are drivers, for your organization, what you may be concerned about, where you find a comfort level for residual remaining risk. So for some organizations, that may be peer comparison. For our industry, how are we? How are we stacking up against others? Or in the sample here, this organization was more worried about, from an insurance provider perspective, have we gone far enough to get ourselves a good premium? Are they going to accept us for a policy? So you can see we can give some, measurements around that, which can give guidance to help an organization decide, if at face value, the value, those numbers are not enough to make that decision, then by coupling it with some other indicators of have we gone far enough, can help them make the decision, okay, yeah, I think we're comfortable, we've got it down far enough, we're going to try to transfer the remaining risk to insurance and cover ourselves with our insurance premium. Or they may say, we haven't gone far enough. We're going to have a really high insurance premium, and I'm just not comfortable with the amount of risk that's still out there. So let's make some additional investments. How can I get this down more? Or let's take a look at where our greatest exposures are, and let's try to deal with some of those. Okay, I talked about the cyber resilience pillars back in the beginning. So for us in our assessment, we map everything back to that. So again, we're trying to make it easy for someone that maybe doesn't do this on a day-to-day basis to understand. So John talked about, that high, medium, low, red, yellow, green. That's what we're doing here, giving you more of a qualitative view of things. So in this case, you can see for this sample organization, they're doing pretty good on their preventive risk controls. So, threat intelligence, a little bit weaker there. But you can see on the reactive controls, especially once you get to pillars 7 and 8, that's their greatest weakness for this organization. They're not in a good spot with what they're doing with their backups to ensure they'll have something to recover, and they're not in a good position for actually executing recovery. So things like, a clean room, isolated recovery environment, or clean data identification. So these different key pieces that we're going to need to effectively recover. Okay. You can also imagine you could double click on these and get to see what are the specific controls I'm missing. So, for example, again, incident recovery, maybe it was the idea I don't have a clean room or isolated recovery environment. So the risk then is that I'm going to be pushing what I think is clean data back into my production. And if I guess wrong, guess what? We're starting back at square one. We're going to have to detect, contain, eradicate, and try to recover again. For some organizations, then they get stuck in this reinfection loop where they keep guessing, guess wrong, and the clock just keeps ticking. Okay, we talked about, for some organizations, they want to know, are we following good practices? Okay, it's great. I understand, where I stand as far as strengths and weaknesses from a cyber resilience pillars point of view, but are we following good practices? So that could be things like, NIST, ISO, CIS. We can give details from a good practice frameworks perspective of if we are aligned to those. And there's a lot of different ones we could do. So, that could be the, NIST, ISO, DORA, GDPR, or a variety of others. Again, depending on your organization, this may be a concern of your leadership to understand really, are we following those good practices? So in addition to having the controls, do we have the good practices and the good hygiene in place within our organization to make sure that we're doing things the right way? Okay, we talked about pure data. So for some organizations, they want to understand really, what does it look like for organizations like ours? So whether it's, overall, other companies of our general size, so revenue, or maybe within our specific industry and size, we want to understand really what that looks like from a peer perspective. So again, one of the nice things we can do with our insurance database is pull, statistics like this to understand really what ourselves as well as our peers are facing. And then we can start to leverage some of this to really start to drive where we want to put our focus and energy and justification around different things. So having all these different data points, again, can help you make more informed, better decisions when it comes to our cyber resilience spend. Okay, and finally here, this one's around cyber threats. So this is a really big one right now. A lot of organizations are really concerned about AI. And what's happening now with AI is it's being used to uncover vulnerabilities within environments. So one of the things we're able to do through our assessment is really look at specific threats. So again, this gets back to the MITRE attack landscape mapping that's been done through our assessment. So we talked about, understanding the value of the tools, but also what it can do is allow us to give a view from a threat perspective of how well we are positioned to deal with that threat. So when I say that, you want to think about tactics and techniques that are leveraged to exploit those vulnerabilities. So if a vulnerability is uncovered, the threat actors can then try to exploit it using various tactics and techniques. And through our assessment, by mapping all these different controls, we're able to give the view of really where your strengths and weaknesses are from those specific tactics and techniques. So on the screen, you're seeing the tactics, the high-level roll-ups. But again, imagine double-click. Within that, there are various techniques. So some techniques you may score better or worse, depending on the controls you have in place. So again, think about your ability to reduce the likelihood or mitigate the impact of. So that's really what we're accounting for through that MITRE attack mapping that's been done. So again, big area of concern right now around AI and those vulnerabilities. This can give you some level of comfort by understanding these specific threats. The other way we can do it is potentially, common vulnerabilities and exposures. So say you want to look at, what are the 10 most common CVEs that are leveraged against organizations like ours. I could then do, an analysis of specific CVEs, those common vulnerabilities and exposures, to again, get a score on how do we stack up against that specific threat. Okay, so again, it can give you a level of confidence in your ability to handle this new threat from AI that can be leveraged by threat actors to try to exploit different vulnerabilities that exist within these different environments. Okay, so let's tie this all back together. Okay, so we talked about very beginning, why do we want to do a cyber resilience assessment? We talked about those use cases. John talked about, the challenges that we're seeing from our customers. We're hearing from them, the struggle to really try to tie all these pieces together, communicate it in an easy way. So by going through a cyber resilience assessment, it really helps your organization to understand your overall risk exposure. And with that, you're able to allow your key stakeholders to really prioritize your threats, justify control investments, strengthen your cyber resilience, and ultimately that'll put you in a position for your organization to not only survive, but to thrive. So we can have a confidence that we'll be able to deal with these specific cyber threats and we will be resilient from that. Now, if you're looking for more information on how 1111 can help you with your cyber resiliency for your organization, you can visit us at 1111systems.com. Also on the screen right now, this QR code and the URL you're seeing will take you out to a free assessment. This assessment is very high level, and it is focused in on, if you think back to our pillars 6, 7, and 8. your ability to effectively respond and recover from a data compromising incident. So think ransomware, malware, data encryption, data destruction. So again, while it's high level, it'll give you some good items to consider to ensuring that you're putting yourself and your organization in a good position to effectively, again, respond and recover from a data compromising incident. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Laura.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian. This has been great to have you walk us through all of this. We do really encourage you to take advantage of our free assessment and then follow up with our team to discuss your cyber resilience goals and strategies. This is such a good tool, and it's free to you. We have a lot of experience here at 1111 putting together these kind of services because 1111 brings together decades of experience delivering IT services, with more than 15 years of that focusing on cloud services, disaster recovery, and cyber recovery. We do know what we're talking about when we're talking about cyber resilience. We truly are a global company with more than 60 data centers and points of presence around the world. So you can see that here on our map, just a little bit of our global coverage that we have. So you really, truly can trust us no matter where you are in the world. And please don't just take our word for it. The industry has awarded and acknowledged all that 1111 can do with many accolades, many awards over the years. And this is just a handful of what analysts and others are saying about 1111 and how they have honored us. So one other thing I did want to bring up, you saw the QR code, and we'll show the QR code again for the assessment, but we also have another QR code here. As I'm taking a look at your questions, this is a chance to highlight that your peers are going through the same things you are. We recently released our global cyber trend survey and published our first ever cyber trends report. You can follow this QR code and download the report to understand the true scope of cyber attacks. And let's look at some of the questions that came up. As I'm going to the first question, I'm going to go back to that QR code that Brian gave us just a moment ago on our cybersecurity assessment. This is where you can look at your cyber recovery and your cyber preventative cybersecurity, your preventative measures, and get a true picture of your risk. Again, this is free to you. I had somebody ask to post it again, so here I am posting that up again as I go to the first question we have. Brian and Jon, where should an organization start if they want to understand their real cyber risk exposure in financial terms, not just a list of technical vulnerabilities?
Okay, thanks, Laura. Hey, Jon, I'll grab this. So this is going to be a bit of a challenge. So, for us, as I mentioned, we're leveraging that insurance claims database. Now, if your organization doesn't have access to something like an insurance claims database, what you're going to have to do is come up with a way to really understand what is the inherent financial risk that we're facing. There's different ways you could try to accomplish this. So some of it, like I mentioned earlier, you could do something like online research. But again, you're going to have reduced access to overall actual incidents. You're only going to see ones that were publicly disclosed. So a little bit limited there to understand what that looks like. But it can give you maybe some direction on things like the most likely cyber threats that you may face. Now, for some organizations, again, the financials can be tricky. So with some organizations, we're seeing leverage things like BIA data. So since a BIA picks up on financial impacts typically, that can somewhat be leveraged for going through an assessment like this from a cyber perspective. A little bit different, but you can use some of that for kind of directional guidance on that. Now, some considerations around the financials. So, and again, this is one of the reasons we use the insurance claims database, because it picks up on all these different components that come into the financial impact. So things you want to think about trying to account for, if it's not already accounted for in things like your BIA, you need to understand response cost. You need to understand disruption cost. What's the business disruption going to cost us? Things like litigation. There's going to be some level of legal fees that come into this, potentially fines or penalties. There's also potentially going to be secondary litigation that comes into play. There's potentially insurance premium increases. If you're publicly traded, it could be dips in your stock price that you need to account for. And then also things like, your brand image damage. So long-term, potentially damage that's done that may have long-lasting financial impact to your organization that you're going to have to overcome. So that's to establish your inherent risk. From a residual, this is probably even a little bit tougher without a tool like ours. You're going to have to figure out a way to understand the value of the investments that you've made. So those different controls, product, services, some way to understand that if I implement product A, it's reducing my risk by X amount. So again, the way we've achieved that is by mapping to MITRE attack. So you would have to do something similar if you're trying to get to the residual. Otherwise, you're most likely going to be stuck with just the inherent, understanding kind of the big picture risk that exists out there.
Hey, Brian, another issue that I see, from my perspective, having been in the business continuity and disaster recovery space for a long time, is when organizations are looking at their cyber risk from that lens, they're forgetting that so much of the business continuity and disaster recovery impact data that they put down on paper was based on known recovery point objectives or recovery time objectives, which from a cyber event, those often go out the window, right? Because we don't always know if our data that we backed up an hour ago or a night ago is going to be clean and recoverable in the same time frame in a cyber event. So that makes using that BIA data that you talked about that much more problematic when you're looking at a cyber event.
Good point, John.
Yeah, and I was just saying this is a good reason to sit down and have a discussion with both of you to know when those RTOs and RPOs will be applicable, or as John said, they go out the window. I do have some other questions here. The next one says, my company already has security tools in place, which is good. I'm glad to hear it. I'm sure you guys are as well. How can I tell and explain to executives whether the investments we've already made are actually reducing residual risk or just adding complexity, cost, etc. for my organization?
Yep, good question. So again, there's different ways you could look at this. So as I mentioned on that previous question, the financial side might be a little bit trickier for you, depending on, what data you have access to try to drive financials. But, from a kind of a high, medium, low type impact view of things, you could start to evaluate and model things with the tools you have. So for example, you may have 3 different products that are doing basically the same thing. So it may not make sense to, have multiple tools that are accomplishing the same thing. So you probably want to assess to make sure that we haven't overinvested in a specific control type. And then also potentially, maybe we're leveraging, a different way to look at it, maybe we're leveraging 4 different tools that accomplish, 10 different things. But there's this other tool that's out in the marketplace that if I go with that, it's actually going to be cheaper than the combination of the other tools and does all the same things. So again, you can do a lot of, especially in the way with our tool, we can do modeling to really see, where are we getting the most return on investment as far as a tool? What's buying down risk? So whether that's from the qualitative or quantitative view of things, with our tools, we're able to give kind of both views to really help ensure that, you're making the best investments. Because again, we all have limited budgets. So, over-investing in, a specific control type is really ultimately not going to do our organization a lot of good. We're probably overspending on that. You're getting diminishing returns because you already have something else in place that's trying to accomplish the same thing. So if we could reduce that spend and then reinvest that somewhere else, maybe where we have weakness or a gap, that probably makes better financial sense and better sense from an overall risk and resilience perspective.
Okay. Here's another good question. What are the biggest gaps that you see between having backups and being truly prepared? What problems are other companies having recovering clean data and getting systems running after they've been hit with a cyber attack?
All right, another good question. Okay, so I think the number one thing I'm hearing now, this is actually a big change from a few years ago when we were hearing a lot of organizations just say, okay, we're just going to use our standard, DR backup. We're just going to use that to recover from a cyber incident. Or, we used to hear a lot of organizations say, no, I'm fine. I replicate data. Okay. Replication, amazing for traditional disaster events, awful for cyber recovery. Because if you think about it, if you're replicating that data, instead of having maybe hours to catch some type of compromise, you may be talking seconds. Okay, so one of the things you hear now, almost every organization you talk to, is they talk about, we have immutable backups. And a lot of organizations are a little bit overconfident because I have an immutable backup. Now, it's good that you're doing that. Absolutely, good practice and something you want to have in place. But immutable does not necessarily equal clean data. You can make compromised data immutable. So, one of the areas that, I think, you need to take a deeper look at is, specifically around backups, make sure you're following good practices there. So yes, immutable, limiting access to that. We don't want to have everyone just have access to that backup data set, offline. So if the threat actors are in our environment, we want to make sure they can't get to that data. So they, we don't want them to destroy that data that's out there. Things like anomaly scanning. So again, I talked about, you can make compromised data immutable. Well, some anomaly scanning can help you understand whether or not potentially that data has already been compromised. From the recovery side of things, the mistake we see, I think most common, is the lack of a clean room or isolated recovery environment, and really understanding a difference between disaster recovery and cyber recovery. So again, a lot of organizations are just following their standard disaster recovery procedures. Okay, I've got the most recent backup. I'm going to recover that and push that right back into my production. I'm going to hit my RTO and RPO, and I'm good to go. As John mentioned, a lot of times that's out the window. And the reason for that is you really want to make sure that what you're going to try to recover is truly clean. So by leveraging a clean room or isolated recovery environment, we're able to take a look at that data, ensure that we're not seeing any indicators of compromise before we push that into our recovery environment. Now, again, a lot of organizations, if they're not doing that, you're taking the risk of, okay, I'm going to quickly recover. But if you guess wrong, so I thought that, this backup was clean, it was immutable, I push it back into my production, and then it turns out that, guess what, that was compromised. I'm now back at square one. I need to detect, contain, eradicate, recover, and potentially I'm going to get caught in this reinfection loop where I just keep guessing and I guess wrong and I have to start over, guess wrong, start over. And we just, keep going through the cycle. And while we're going through the cycle, the clock keeps ticking. We're getting further and further away from, that time of compromise. Okay, so it definitely becomes a challenge. The other thing to keep in mind too is around the backups, taking a deeper dive at your data retention periods. A blanket policy on data retention is not always the best way to go for cyber recovery. The example I like to give here is, we want to make sure that we have those backups of our vital data, so the most critical data within our environment. But the value of the data, depending on where it's coming from, will vary greatly in the value of it over time. So the example I always give here is warehouse management. So if I have a distribution center that has high turnover, the warehouse management system data is vital data to my organization. We use it all day, every day. But if I went to them and said, okay, I've got your warehouse management data we're going to restore from 6 months ago, they're going to tell me, don't even bother. I'm going to have to go back out to that warehouse and recount everything anyway, so don't even bother. Versus you may have another system where you're legally required to have the full historical data. If I told someone I'm going to give you something from 6 months ago that'll have everything prior to that, they'll say, we'll take it. It's not ideal. We'll take it. At least gives us a starting point. And then we're going to have to figure out a way to rebuild, recreate the missing data from the last 6 months. So that's a lot of times where your business continuity can come into play. How can we get this data rebuilt, recreated?
Okay, that's good to know. This next person says that they'd love to do a cyber resilient assessment with us. That sounds great. But they want to know, but how can I use it to prioritize the next security or recovery investment that will have the greatest impact on my business?
Okay. Yeah. So again, I think if you go back to, kind of what we presented as far as, the outcomes, really what the focus is for your organization, there's different ways it can be presented. So it could be the idea of, maybe what we're trying to do is reduce that highest risk. So if you think back to the pillars for that sample one, pillars 7 and 8 were red. We had the greatest exposure there. So for some organizations, they're going to say, okay, let's reduce that exposure. So even though that may not be the highest financial impact there, we know that we're not protected there at all. So if that's where they try to hit us, that's going to cause us a lot of pain. And then for other organizations, they're going to look at it a little bit different. Say, look, I recognize that pillars 7 and 8 are red right now, but I also have done some analysis based off of the modeling that says if I go with product A, it's going to drive down the financial impact more than the other one will. They may go with that over the qualitative gap that was out there, the red, yellow, green. So again, this will vary from organization to organization, different approaches you can take to it. But by going through this assessment, you have those data points to make that decision. So, again, every organization will be a little bit different, but you'll have all those data points to make a really informed decision around that.
I was going to show our map or your heat map here really quickly, and I pushed the wrong slide, but here's that slide you were talking about. Sorry about that there. Mistakes happen.
You got it, Laura. So yeah, so within here, you can see, kind of that heat map of your strengths and weaknesses. And again, we'd be able to dive into, if you wanted to see specifically within 7 and 8, what are the key controls that are missing? We'd be able to identify the specific controls. So that may be where we want to make our investment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. We got one more question. I think we have time for just about one more question, and then we'll need to wrap things up. And I think this next person is dealing with what a lot of people are dealing with. How can I make the case to my executives? I'm having a hard time explaining how truly vulnerable we are. We've been lucky. Now our executives and our board are a little complacent. What metrics or outcomes matter most in making the case for action?
Okay, another good question. So I think, as we went through the presentation today, we saw, again, back to the use cases and really modifying kind of those outcomes or outputs based off of your use case. So again, every organization is a little bit different. The leadership's going to be a little bit different. What speaks to them, you probably are more familiar with what data points are going to resonate with them. But you have to make sure it's going to be in a plain language. If it's, in practitioner terms around security, you're in the weeds, you're going to lose them. So you have to make it easy for everyone to understand. So again, I think, the best approach is kind of the combination of the qualitative and quantitative. So if I can give you the heat map, so in our case, from the cyber resilience pillars view, I can show you, which controls within that are missing. And then I tie that to financials. It makes a really strong case, really strong story to really help justify, the case for additional investment. So, everybody can understand high tied with X amount of dollars. That speaks to everyone. It's a common language. Without us having to get any technical details, everyone can really understand that. So I think, in a perfect world, that's the best way to try to present that. So again, qualitative and quantitative view, and then mix in some of those details from those use cases that will speak to your leadership.
Okay, that's a smart plan. Thank you so much, Brian and Jon. With that question, we're going to wrap things up. One more chance to look at that Cyber Trends Report QR code. And I'll just say thank you so much to everyone. If we didn't have a chance to answer your question during the presentation today, we'll follow up with you after this over the next few days. So on behalf of Brian and Jon and everyone here at 1111 Systems, we want to thank you for joining us for today's discussion about cyber resilience, and we want you to have a great day. Thank you.